At midnight on 11 June 1988, Chief Warrant Officer 3, Doug Hare, pulls collective over the N'Djamena tarmac in Chad, lifting his MH-47 Chinook into the Saharan night. Behind him, a second Chinook climbs out. They are flying 550 miles into hostile territory with no GPS, no fighter escort, and a plan to recover a 10-ton Soviet gunship before sunrise. The mission is called Mount Hope 3. Hare navigates by compass, map, and stopwatch across featureless desert. If he drifts off course by more than 2 degrees, his crew runs out of fuel over empty sand. If Libyan MiG-23 fighters detect them, his Chinook maxes out at 140 knots, unladen. The MiGs fly at 900. His engines are already burning hot from the auxiliary fuel load. The hardest part will not be combat. It will be weight, heat, and distance. Earlier that year, in March 1987, Chadian forces armed with Toyota pickups and French-supplied missiles overran Ouadi Doum, a Libyan airbase in northern Chad. The Libyan garrison retreated in hours, abandoning an estimated $1.5 billion in equipment. Among the wreckage sat a flyable Mi-24 Hind D attack helicopter, NATO codename Satan's Chariot. One engine had taken bullet damage, but the airframe was intact. The Hind had been the Soviet Union's premier gunship for a decade, fitted with armor plate, rocket pods, and an undernose cannon. U.S. intelligence had never captured an export model. For the Pentagon, the abandoned helicopter was a data goldmine. If someone could retrieve it before the Libyans returned. U.S. intelligence had photographed Hind gunships in Afghanistan and Angola, but never tested one on American soil. The Pentagon wanted to know the armor's weak points, the engine's thermal signature, and the vulnerability of the rotor hub. Authorization for recovery came from the highest levels. The challenge was diplomatic, not tactical. Chad controlled the wreckage, but France held influence in the region. The U.S. State Department opened quiet negotiations in mid-1987, coordinating with both governments. The mission would require cash, hardware, and secrecy. If the Soviets or Libyans learned of the plan, they would destroy the helicopter before the Americans could reach it. In January 1988, after 8 months of negotiation, Chad agreed. The price was $2 million cash, plus a batch of FIM-92 Stinger shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. The Stingers gave Chad a credible defense against Libyan air raids. The cash went to President Hissène Habre's government. France signed off, provided the operation remained covert and no French forces participated directly. The agreement gave the U.S. a narrow extraction window. The Hind sat in the open at Ouadi Doum, 490 miles north of the capital. Libyan reconnaissance flights still crossed the border weekly. If the Americans delayed, the wreckage might be destroyed or moved. The Pentagon assigned the mission to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers. In April 1988, 2 MH-47D Chinook crews deployed to White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico for desert training. The 160th had flown heavy sling loads before, but never a 10-ton Soviet helicopter with unknown weight distribution. To simulate the Hind, loadmasters rigged 6 500-gallon water blivets beneath one Chinook, estimating a total external load of roughly 18,000 pounds. The crews practiced night flying at low altitude, using only compass and map for navigation. They rehearsed landing, rigging the sling cables, and lifting off under simulated time pressure. The water blivets gave them a rough sense of the load's behavior in flight, but they could not replicate the Hind's actual center of gravity because no reliable Soviet weight data existed. That unknown would wait until they stood beside the real aircraft in Chad. On 10 June 1988, a U.S. Air Force C-5 Galaxy transport landed at N'Djamena, carrying 2 disassembled MH-47 Chinooks and more than 60 Night Stalker personnel. Ground crews worked through the afternoon heat, reassembling both helicopters on the tarmac. Flight engineers installed auxiliary fuel tanks inside the cargo bays extending the Chinook's range, but adding weight that would have to be burned off before the return leg with the Hind. The mission was scheduled for midnight departure. The teams conducted final pre-flight checks, loaded tools for rotor disassembly, and rigged sling cables. The Chadian government provided perimeter security, but no direct support. If the mission failed, the U.S. crews were on their own, 3,000 miles from home. The lead pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Doug Hare, received his final weather brief at 2200 hours. Skies were clear, winds light, but Libyan MiG-23 flogger fighters remained active along the northern border. U.S. intelligence could not guarantee the Libyans would not detect the Chinooks. If they did, the Night Stalkers had no fighter escort. An unladen MH-47 cruises at 140 knots. A MiG-23 intercepts at 900 knots. The Chinooks carried no air-to-air countermeasures and no weapons effective against a fast mover. Hare's only defense was terrain masking and darkness. He planned to fly at 200 feet, below radar coverage, and rely on the Libyans not expecting helicopters 500 miles inside Chadian airspace. If they scrambled fighters, the mission was over. In 1988, the global positioning system was still under development. Civilian and most military aircraft relied on ground-based navigation aids, which did not exist in the Central Sahara. Hare would navigate 550 miles using a compass, a paper map, a stopwatch, and dead reckoning. He plotted waypoints based on prominent terrain features visible in satellite photos, a dry riverbed, a cluster of hills, but much of the route crossed featureless sand. A 2-degree heading error compounded over 3 hours would put the formation 20 miles off course. If they missed the refueling points, they would run out of fuel over empty desert. There was no search and rescue helicopter with the range to reach them. Precision mattered, and Hare had no electronic backup. The ground crew faced a different problem. To transport the Hind beneath a Chinook, they had to remove the helicopter's 5-blade main rotor. The rotor blades, each 8.5 feet long, would create excessive drag and width if left attached. The team had no Mi-24 maintenance manuals, no diagrams of the rotor hub, and no torque specifications for the Soviet fasteners. U.S. mechanics train on American aircraft with SAE standard bolts. Soviet engineers used metric threads with unfamiliar pitch and head profiles. The crew packed a range of sockets and wrenches, but they would not know which tools fit until they stood beside the actual helicopter. If the bolts were seized or damaged, they would have to improvise with penetrating oil, heat, or brute force. They had 90 minutes on the ground before sunrise. Sunrise at Ouadi Doum on 11 June was calculated at 0600 hours local. That gave the team 90 minutes from touchdown to liftoff. The constraint was not arbitrary. Libyan reconnaissance flights typically launched at first light, sweeping southward along the border. If a Libyan pilot spotted the American helicopters on the ground, he would radio coordinates to his command post. Fighters could scramble from Azou or Matan al-Sara within 30 minutes. The Chinooks could not outrun them, and the crew could not defend the aircraft without inviting an international incident. The mission plan required wheels up before 0600. If the rotor bolts did not come free in time, the team would have to destroy the Hind, abandon the mission, and extract empty-handed. There was no contingency for delay. At midnight on 11 June, both Chinooks lifted off from N'Djamena on a heading of 015 degrees. Hare held his aircraft at 200 feet above ground level to stay under Libyan radar. The co-pilot monitored fuel flow. Each Chinook carried internal auxiliary tanks, but the mission planners had removed some bladders to leave weight margin for the Hind on the return leg. That decision meant the outbound flight was fuel critical. If they burned more than planned due to headwinds or navigation errors, they would not have enough to bring the Hind home. Hare flew by compass and stopwatch, checking terrain features against his map when the moonlight allowed. The formation maintained radio silence. Behind them, N'Djamena disappeared into the dark. Ahead lay 550 miles of empty sand. 2 hours into the flight, the formation descended toward the first forward arming and refueling point at Faya-Largeau, a small oasis settlement 280 miles northeast of N'Djamena. U.S. Air Force C-130 Hercules tankers had pre-positioned rubber fuel bladders on the desert floor earlier that day. The Chinooks landed, and loadmasters unspooled hoses from the bladders to the helicopter's fuel ports. Refueling took 18 minutes. Hare kept the engines running to save battery power and maintain the timeline. Both aircraft took on enough JP-8 to reach Ouadi Doum with a reserve for the ground operation. At 0:20 hours, the Chinooks lifted off again, turning north toward the Libyan border. The second leg would take them over territory where no American helicopters had flown since the start of the Libyan-Chadian conflict. At 0400 hours, Hare spotted the perimeter lights of Ouadi Doum. An advance team of U.S. and Chadian special forces had secured the airfield earlier that night. The Chinooks flared and touched down 50 yards from the Hind, which sat under camouflage netting exactly where reconnaissance photos had placed it. The ground crew jumped out before the ramp fully lowered. Maintenance Chief Master Sergeant James Crisafulli led the team toward the Soviet helicopter, carrying toolboxes, sling cables, and portable lights. The Hind was larger up close than they had expected, roughly 57 feet long with a 5-blade rotor spanning 56 feet. The bullet-damaged engine showed scorching around the exhaust vent, but the airframe was intact. Crisafulli's watch read 04:02. He had 88 minutes to remove the rotor and rig the sling. Crisafulli climbed onto the Hind's fuselage to inspect the rotor hub. 5 blades radiated from the central mast, each secured by a cluster of bolts. He tried a standard 3/4-inch SAE socket on the first bolt head. It did not fit. He tried metric sizes, 18mm, 19mm. Still no match. The Soviet engineers had used a non-standard profile. After testing 6 sockets, a 21mm deep socket seated correctly, but the bolt would not turn. Corrosion and desert sand had seized the threads. Crisafulli sprayed penetrating oil and waited 30 seconds, then applied a breaker bar. The bolt cracked free. He marked the time, 04:10 hours. 4 blades remained, and each blade had multiple attachment points. His crew worked in pairs, one man on the breaker bar, another catching hardware before it fell into the sand. At 05:10 hours, the crew freed the 5th and final rotor blade. The disassembly had taken 70 minutes, leaving 20 minutes before sunrise. Loadmasters laid the blades on the sand and turned to the sling rigging. The Hind's empty weight was listed in Soviet manuals at approximately 8,400 kilograms, or 18,500 pounds. But that figure did not account for remaining fuel, ammunition, or the intact tail rotor. The crew had no scale and no engineered lifting plan. They estimated the center of gravity by measuring the fuselage length and marking a point slightly aft of the main rotor mast. They threaded 3 steel cables beneath the Hind's belly and connected them to a single apex shackle. That shackle would hook to the Chinook's center cargo hook, which was rated at 26,000 pounds. If the cable slipped or the balance was wrong, the load would swing and destabilize the helicopter carrying it. A Chinook generates lift by accelerating air downward through its 2 counter-rotating rotors. Adding an external load increases rotor disk loading, which is the total weight divided by the combined rotor area. Higher disk loading demands more engine power to maintain altitude. When the load hangs beneath the aircraft, it also shifts the center of gravity. If the sling cables attach even 6 inches off the true center, the load will pendulum during flight. That pendulum motion introduces a dynamic instability. The pilot must counter the swing with cyclic stick inputs, but each correction costs airspeed and power. The Chinook's center cargo hook is designed for loads up to 26,000 pounds in calm air. The Hind, with fuel and hardware, was estimated near 20,000 pounds, within spec. But the crew did not yet know the combined weight of the Chinook plus the Hind was about to exceed the aircraft's certified maximum gross weight. At 05:30 hours, Hare positioned his Chinook above the slung Hind, and the loadmaster hooked the apex shackle to the cargo hook. Hare pulled collective to lift the load. The Hind rose off the sand, cables went taut, and both of the Chinook's engine instruments spiked into the red. The combined weight was approximately 65,000 pounds, 15,000 pounds over the MH-47's maximum certificated gross weight of 50,000 pounds. That represented a 30% overload. The Chinook's two Lycoming T55 turboshaft engines, each rated at 3,750 shaft horsepower, were generating maximum continuous power just to hover at ground level. Hare's co-pilot called out engine temps, 50 degrees Fahrenheit above normal operating range. Hare held the hover for 10 seconds while the loadmaster confirmed the sling was stable, then nosed forward to transition to forward flight. Turboshaft engines produce maximum power at sea level because air density is highest there. As altitude increases, air thins, and the engine's compressor ingests fewer oxygen molecules per second, reducing combustion efficiency and power output. Temperature has the same effect. Hot desert air at sea level behaves like thinner air at higher altitude, a phenomenon called density altitude. On the morning of 11 June, the density altitude at Ouadi Doum was calculated at approximately 3,500 feet, even though the airfield sat near 900 feet elevation. At that density altitude, Hare's engines could not produce their rated power. He was already at maximum continuous power in the hover. Climbing would require more power than the engines could deliver. He faced a choice: attempt to climb to a safe altitude and risk losing airspeed until the aircraft descended back to the ground, or accept zero altitude margin and fly the entire return leg at 200 feet. Hare nosed the Chinook forward and accelerated to 90 knots, well below the normal cruise speed of 140 knots. At 90 knots, the engines were producing just enough power to maintain 200 feet above the desert floor. Ground effect, the cushion of compressed air between the rotor disc and the ground, provided a small reduction in power demand below 100 feet, but Hare could not descend further without risking a collision with terrain. He trimmed the aircraft for maximum range airspeed and held altitude. The co-pilot monitored engine parameters. Both turbines were running 50 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than normal, inside the caution band, but below the emergency shutdown threshold. Hare could not reduce power without descending, and he could not descend without hitting the sand. The only option was to hold 200 feet and 90 knots for the next 550 miles, and hope the engines did not fail. 1 hour into the return flight, the formation reached the second forward arming and refueling point at Moussoro, approximately 230 miles south of Ouadi Doum. Hare set the Hind down gently on the sand and shut down the engines. Engine temps dropped during the 12-minute refueling stop. The crew topped off both Chinooks with JP-8 from pre-positioned bladders. Hare checked the Hind's sling cables. No fraying, no slippage. The loadmaster reported the load was stable. At 0710 hours, Hare restarted the engines and lifted off. The engine temps spiked again immediately, returning to 50 degrees over normal as soon as the Chinook pulled the Hind off the ground. The second leg would take them across the most remote section of the route, 200 miles of open desert with no landmarks and no alternate landing sites. Hare reset his stopwatch and resumed the heading toward N'Djamena. At 0800 hours, 200 miles from N'Djamena, the co-pilot called out a wall of sand on the horizon. A Saharan sandstorm, estimated at 3,000 feet tall, was moving perpendicular to their course. Hare had 90 seconds before the formation entered the storm. He considered his options. Standard procedure called for climbing above the weather or detouring around it. Climbing was impossible. His engines were already at maximum power, just maintaining 200 feet. A detour would add 50 miles and burn fuel he did not have. Hare keyed the radio and told the second Chinook to close formation. In 60 seconds, visibility dropped to 0. The horizon disappeared. Hare transitioned to instruments, trusting his attitude indicator and radar altimeter to keep the aircraft level and above the ground. He could not see the Hind swinging beneath him. Inside the storm, Hare flew on instruments: attitude indicator for pitch and roll, radar altimeter for height above ground, compass for heading. The Chinook pitched and yawed as crosswinds buffeted the fuselage and the slung Hind. Each gust swung the load 10 to 20 degrees left or right. Hare countered with cyclic stick inputs, but every correction bled airspeed. The airspeed indicator dropped from 90 knots to 85, then 80. He pushed the nose forward to regain speed, and the radar altimeter showed a descent. 180 feet. 170 feet. He pulled back on the cyclic to level off, and airspeed dropped again. The engines were already at maximum power. He had no reserve to climb or accelerate. The co-pilot called out radio contact lost with the second Chinook. Hare held course and altitude, trusting the other pilot was doing the same. The sandstorm lasted 20 minutes. Hare held heading 195 degrees, the reciprocal course back to N'Djamena. He focused on the attitude indicator and radar altimeter, scanning every 2 seconds, correcting pitch and roll before they built into larger deviations. The co-pilot watched the engine instruments. Turbine temps held steady at 50 degrees over normal, no further increase. Fuel flow was higher than planned because of the control inputs fighting the load swing, but they still had reserve. At 0820 hours, the windscreen brightened. Visibility returned in stages. First 100 feet, then 500 feet, then clear air. Hare looked down. The Hind was still attached, swinging gently beneath the Chinook. The second Chinook appeared half a mile to the west, back in formation. The worst was over, but they still had 150 miles to go. At 0830 hours, the co-pilot ran the fuel calculation. Current burn rate, accounting for the higher consumption during the storm, left them 45 minutes of fuel at 90 knots. N'Djamena was 30 minutes ahead, assuming no further navigation errors and no additional weather. That gave a 15-minute reserve, tighter than planned, but acceptable. Hare maintained 200 feet and 90 knots, resisting the temptation to climb now that the storm had passed. The engines were still running hot. Any increase in power demand risked pushing them past the emergency shutdown threshold. He could see the curvature of Lake Chad on the southern horizon, a navigation landmark confirming they were on course. The formation descended slightly to 150 feet to take advantage of ground effect for the final 30 miles, squeezing a small reduction in power demand from the thicker air near the surface. At 0850 hours, Hare spotted the N'Djamena airfield. He radioed the tower and received clearance to land. He slowed the formation to 60 knots and descended to 100 feet, bringing the Hind down gradually to avoid shock loading the sling cables. At 50 feet, he transitioned to a hover over the designated unloading area. Loadmasters on the ground guided him with hand signals. Hare lowered the Hind until its landing gear touched the tarmac, then held the Chinook steady while the loadmaster released the cargo hook. The cables went slack. The Hind settled onto its wheels. Hare climbed away, unburdened, and landed 100 yards distant. He shut down the engines. The turbine temps took 5 minutes to drop out of the caution range. The entire flight, from midnight departure to final landing, had lasted 8 hours and 50 minutes. No shots had been fired. Within 4 hours of landing, the C-5 Galaxy arrived at N'Djamena to recover both Chinooks and the Hind. Ground crews disassembled the rotor blades from the Chinooks and used a forklift to load the Hind into the Galaxy's cargo bay. The Soviet helicopter fit with 6 inches of clearance on each side. The C-5 departed that afternoon, flying directly to Fort Rucker, Alabama, the U.S. Army's aviation center. The Hind arrived on 16 June 1988, 6 days after the mission launched. Engine analysis showed both Lycoming T-55 turboshafts on Hare's Chinook had sustained elevated wear from the prolonged operation at maximum continuous power, but neither engine required immediate replacement. The aircraft returned to service after standard maintenance. The Hind became the most intact Soviet attack helicopter ever captured by the United States. U.S. engineers at Fort Rucker spent 6 months restoring the Hind to flying condition and conducting detailed tests. They mapped the armor's thickness and composition, discovering it provided effective protection against 12.7mm rounds, but was vulnerable to 23mm cannon fire. They test-fired the nose-mounted 12.7mm machine gun and the underwing rocket pods. Infrared signature tests revealed that the Hind's inline engine exhaust vents produced a strong heat signature, visible to early-generation infrared missiles like the FIM-92 Stinger. That vulnerability explained the high loss rate of Hinds in Afghanistan, where Stinger-equipped Mujahideen had shot down dozens. Soviet designers later corrected the flaw in the Mi-28 Havoc, the Hind's successor, by repositioning the exhaust system. The captured helicopter provided data that informed U.S. tactics for decades. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment published new guidance for extreme-range sling-load missions in 1989. Crews were required to calculate density altitude and engine power margins before departure, using ambient temperature and airfield elevation. The new doctrine stated that maximum gross weight limits could be exceeded only if pilots accepted zero altitude margin and reduced airspeed throughout the mission. Flight engineers were required to monitor engine temps continuously and abort if temps exceeded the emergency shutdown threshold for more than 2 minutes. The Mount Hope 3 mission became a mandatory case study in 160th SOAR initial qualification training, emphasizing that risk calculation and constraint management were as critical as flying skill. The lesson was clear. Special operations success depends as much on loadmasters, navigators, and maintenance crews as on pilots. Mount Hope 3 proved that deep strike recovery missions were feasible, with careful planning and crew discipline. The mission validated the MH-47 Chinook as a heavy-lift platform capable of operating 550 miles beyond friendly lines, with minimal support. It also demonstrated that navigation by dead reckoning remained viable, even in the age of emerging satellite technology. The 160th SOAR applied lessons from the mission during operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, where teams recovered downed aircraft and sensitive equipment from contested territory. The mission's success reinforced the regiment's reputation as the military's most capable special operations aviation unit. The captured Hind was used throughout the 1990s as an aggressor aircraft in U.S. training exercises, allowing American pilots to practice tactics against a realistic Soviet threat platform. In 2012, the U.S. Army transferred the captured Hind to the Southern Museum of Flight in Birmingham, Alabama, where it remains on public display. The helicopter shows no bullet holes from the mission because no shots were fired during the extraction. Visitors can walk beneath the 5-blade rotor and inspect the armored cockpit. A placard describes Operation Mount Hope 3 and the 550-mile night flight. The museum notes that the mission succeeded not because of superior firepower, but because of weight calculations, rotor disassembly, fuel discipline, and dead reckoning navigation. The hardest enemy was not Libyan fighters or Soviet engineers. It was weight, heat, and distance. The crew overcame those constraints with tools, stopwatches, and a refusal to exceed the limits of their aircraft by more than 30%. That refusal kept them alive.